Welcome again, everyone. I am Sharice Martin, the Program Manager for Professional Development at the American Society for Cell Biology. We are pleased to offer Online with LSE as a part of ASCB's Professional Development webinar series. Today, our facilitator, Dr. Becca Price, will be introducing our featured author for this installment of Online with LSE. Becca, you can turn your camera on now.
Thanks so much, Teresa, for getting us started, and welcome everybody to a conversation about the LSE Evidence-based Teaching Guides and the Inclusive Teaching Evidence-based Guide in particular. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists to you today. We'll begin with Dr. Bryan Dewsbury. Bryan is an associate professor of biology at the University of Rhode Island. He's the principal investigator of the Science, Education, and Society SEAS research program, where working in a team, scholars are blending research on the social context of teaching and learning, faculty development of inclusive practices, and programming in the cultivation of equity in education. He's also a fellow with the John N. Gardner Institute, where he assists institutions of higher education cultivate best practices in inclusive education. Dr. Dewsbury was born and raised in Trinidad and Tobago, and he immigrated to the US in 1999. I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Cynthia Brame here. Cynthia is an associate director of the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt University, and also a principal senior lecturer of biological sciences at Vanderbilt. She leads several initiatives within the Center for Teaching, including the Junior Faculty Teaching Fellows Program. Much of her effort focuses on working with STEM faculty as they strive for more inclusive and equitable approaches to working with students. Cynthia is also on the editorial board of LSE and is co-editor of the Evidence-based Teaching Guide feature with Christy Wilson. Bryan and Cynthia.
Hello, how are you all? We are going to start with a reminder to you that we welcome you. We're glad to see you. We ask that you ask questions during the webinar using the Q&A feature. And you may want to check your audio settings in the lower left-hand corner. So I think we should have showed you that earlier. I apologize for that. So we want to take just a minute and introduce the evidence-based teaching guides before we talk about the guide on inclusive teaching in particular. So the evidence-based teaching guides are intended to facilitate the adoption of evidence-based teaching practices, in large part by making the literature that informs these teaching choices more accessible. And as Becca said, I co-edit this feature with Christy Wilson at Marian University, and Adele Wolfson, an emeritus professor from Wellesley, is a reviewer for the guides. So we just want you to know a few things about the guides, including where they're located. So each guide has a landing page that maps the guide, sort of tells you the overall structure of how the guide is the overall structure of the guide, and it provides multiple landing points. So each one of these nodes is an interactive node, so you can access it at various places. When you click on a given node, that takes you into the meat of the guide. So you find the synthesis of key findings from the literature relevant to that topic. So this is the systems thinking node of that guide that we were looking at previously. So you find a synthesis of the literature, and then links to and summaries of articles that support these descriptions at the top. In addition, each guide has an instructor checklist, so you can sort of investigate the various literature that supports the assertions within the guide. But then we wanted to provide something that was really concise and printable and usable. And so each guide has a printable instructor checklist that you can use as sort of shorthand to guide your thinking as you walk away from your computer and think about what you're going to do in your classroom. Each guide also has an introductory paper that describes the guide and identifies open research questions. You hopefully are always alerted to the presence of a new guide by these papers when they come out. We currently have 5 guides, one on group work with Peggy Brickman, this one on inclusive teaching, one on peer instruction with Jenny Knight, one on modeling in the classroom, and then a new one on student metacognition. And we have more in the works. Where you can find them. So a link to the guides is found at the top right of the LSE homepage. Okay, now let's talk about this guide, the Inclusive Teaching Guide. I think all we really want to say about it is that it focuses on inclusivity across race, ethnicity, and gender. And it relies on a philosophy of deep teaching that Bryan has introduced to the field. Bryan, would you add anything to this before I stop sharing the slides?
I think you mostly covered it. Maybe just to say that the original deep teaching paper can be found in Cultural Studies in Science Education is a 2019 publication, and that's a much longer read, about 12,000 words. But given the subject matter, I felt it necessary to have a place where I had this space to really fully articulate why some of these things matter. You will find when you read that, and also from the guide itself, that we do draw from a lot of literature from the K-12 world, who quite frankly has been discussing this at length for a century before I think we in higher ed took it as seriously as we need to. So we hope that rabbit hole is a fruitful one for you, and this kind of points you to that.
Thank you for that introduction. And I encourage the audience to send in questions through the Q&A. Feel free to ask questions about the evidence-based teaching guides in general, or this particular example on inclusive teaching. I have a question to get us started. And maybe we can start with Bryan and then go to Cynthia. And that's about inclusive teaching in particular. What do you think everybody should know about inclusive teaching?
What do I think everybody should know? How much time we have for that question, Rebecca?
2 hours. No.
Well, I think anybody who knows me knows that I struggle to distill things like inclusive teaching into a thing everybody should know, right? And I know that's not the spirit of your question, but I do feel it's important to say that. However, maybe if from my kind of paradigm and lens of this, why I feel everybody should be thinking about inclusive teaching and what they should think about it, I want them to think about it more as how you center people's humanity in the education experience. That for me is the key thing. I've been a little disappointed at how much the conversation has been reduced to, different slides and I'm not saying those things shouldn't happen, they should, but that actually is not the most important piece, right? So if your audience could really think about inclusive teaching being, how do you center people's, and by people I mean the practitioners and the students, how do you center their humanity in the process of education?
I love that. I love that. Yeah. So what I have to say is absolutely consistent with that, just framed a little bit differently. So I want people to know that there's no cookbook to this, that it's a mindset. And is that what we want to do is to be responsive to the people who are in our classes. And I love Bryan's point that that's responsive to the practitioners, the people who are teaching, as well as the students, right? But we also, in addition to being responsive to who's in our classroom at any given time, we want to build in structures that help us promote inclusion and equity across differences that we might not be aware of at a given time. So there are various ways to do that, but we want to be sort of proactive about thinking about building in structures. And there's some of them are very simple things, right? Like building in wait time for students to think before speaking or responding in a different way, having structures for student interactions, having different mechanisms for students to share questions and to share ideas, having different ways for students to access course materials. So we want to center students' humanity, be responsive to who's in the class, but also have done some forethought to build in structures to be inclusive when we enter the classroom at first.
Thank you. Your answers are talking about how our students are different and we need to respect those differences and really honor them. Unfortunately, one of the ideas that is prevalent in American society is the idea of colorblindness, right? That we don't need to look at people's differences. So somebody in our audience wrote in the question, as an educator who researches perceived barriers to inclusive education, what advice could you give to garner buy-in and overcome the colorblind ideology that exists in so many of our STEM courses?
Who would you like to take that first?
Bryan, why don't you start? And then Cynthia, please feel free to add on.
Sure. So there are two questions embedded in that question. One is a question about taking on colorblindness as a unique thing, which is its own kind of discussion. And then there's the question built in there is how do you encourage faculty, empower faculty, convince faculty to consider thinking about their classroom in the way that we're describing in this hour, right? And I want to leave the colorblindness just aside for a second, because I think the second part of the question is actually, I don't want to say more important, but it's a really powerful one, because if we're really going to transform higher ed, we need all of us at the table, right? It can't just be the woke few or the choir or the attendees to the teaching and learning center. We need everybody to really believe in this as a social justice mission, right? And what I've found, first of all, what I would say is I am heartened and impressed and encouraged by the better angels of our faculty nature. I have met across the country more people really willing to consider and think about this than there are people who are just saying like, nah, I don't want any part of this, right? So I think the kind of narrative of the intransigent faculty is not a completely true one. The question then is, how do you get to those better angels, right? And this is just my experience doing faculty development. Dr. Brame could probably comment on her experience. Different people are tuned in by different things. Some people need to see that graph with the data sets, right? Some people need to see a publication by somebody they trust. Some people need to hear the voice of a student who went through a class that Dr. Brame taught. Somebody needs to meet Dr. Brame in the hallway and have her explain what it's, some people need a dean to say, you know what, this is what we're gonna do. So everybody, it's actually a smorgasbord of things that get people bought in, right? So if you are one of those kind of self-identified change agents, you actually have to be quite patient. And it sounds like kind of silly, facetious advice, but I'm being very serious, right? I can tell you at my institution, conversations we're having now in my department, I'm just speaking for my department, 7 years ago were completely dead on arrival. Like you wouldn't even think to say the word inclusion. But everybody had to come at it at their own pace. So to the colorblind piece, somebody can have a colorblind ideology and it can be pointed out to them that, here's some of the issues with that. But then you also have to recognize that when they are being challenged, you are asking them to reorient the entire way in which they've identified themselves around this issue, right? So I'm not trying to absolve them of being accountable for that, but I'm asking you as a change agent to recognize how difficult that is for anybody. And so they need time, they need patience, they need care, actually. They need forgiveness. They need, guides like this, right? They need a whole lot of things to go from that. And it's not just going to be a yell at them and then the next day they start flipping their classroom. That's not how this works. So, I wish I could address the colorblind issue a lot more, but I think the second question was a bit more overarching. Cynthia?
Oh man, I could not agree with you more. I mean, that what you said is so perfect. I think of it as just like as a process of chipping away and using different tools, different days, right? So as you said, different people need different things. And so bringing different tools to bear, letters from students, or as you said, the graph, or focus from the dean, that's lovely. And you're absolutely right. Like, I think a key piece to me is knowing that each of us has that better angel in us, and all we need to do is wake it up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Part of what I really appreciated about your answers is that you're applying inclusive teaching to faculty development, right? You're acknowledging that everybody's coming from a different starting point, and everybody's going to need different experiences to start implementing inclusive practices. So I appreciate the consistency there and modeling.
Well, Becca, if I just quickly add to what you're saying, we are doing that because of what we said the first time. We are centralizing humanity in the process, right? So in the same way, you need to center the students' humanity, you need to center ours as well, right? We all kind of beholden to the same physiology. And so if we kind of understand that, it's just a different way of seeing that interaction.
So we have another question that came up, actually quite similar. And here the focus is on, what about faculty members who, instead of subscribing to a colorblind philosophy, they're coming from other countries where they don't have direct experience with the particular form of systemic racism that we have in the US.
So
and
me?
so they,
Go on.
Bryan, I can tell you have thoughts.
No. I want Cynthia to go first, but the way the person described the question, I felt like it literally just described me. But go on.
Okay. So so the question is, say you're working with international faculty who don't understand the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion work that's going on in our universities, and are just kind of feel like it's a distraction to what the true purposes are to their professorial roles. So I actually would love it if Bryan could start answering this one again, because you about this is me, this is what happened to me. And then again, Cynthia, please add on.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean or want to dominate, but so I feel, Becca, that I have a good amount of privilege with that question, because that has been my experience. I didn't come as a faculty member, but I came to the US as an undergraduate with an F1 visa, student visa, and I didn't grow up in a country that had the kind of race issues that exist in the US, at least not to that extent. So my college years, and I would say maybe my early grad school years, was an interesting learning curve, because perhaps unlike other countries, I did come here as a person of African descent and of color. So phenotypically, when I walk the streets and have interactions, some of the experiences I've had are reflective of the Black American experience and not, the Bryan Trinidadian experience, right? And so going through those things for the first, second, third, fourth, fifth time, you can know intellectually what racism means, but then when you experience it, it's a different type of lesson, right? Experiential learning, shall we, right? So so to the faculty members' point about the kind of distraction from other professorial duties, here's the thing. We would all love to just do that, right? Like in a perfect, if all of these social issues were not a were not as intransigent as they are, right? We would all love to wake up, and this is faculty and students, we'd all love to just go to campus, go to class, engage in the beauty of the pursuit of knowledge. It is truly a beautiful thing, right?
Mhm.
But the reality is, we have some social issues to address to ensure everybody has an equal opportunity to be fully engaged, just like we want to be. So I understand the perspective of coming from a place where this hasn't been your experience, but I do believe that if you're going to be a part of a new community, it behooves you to understand how the new social dynamics in that community operate and what your role is to help with fissures, to help with uplift, to help with elevation, to help with mentoring. I don't think you get to just sort of check out because it hasn't been your experience, right? So I'm not saying that's what they want to do, but I think there'll have to be some learning that takes place, right? Just like I suppose American professors as well. But once that happens, I think you can see and feel and be similarly empowered like everybody else.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. And I think it, for those faculty members, like for all of us, it's part of an ongoing conversation to sort of highlight what we need to do in order for that beautiful knowledge that we're building to be accessible and attractive and appealing to all of our students. I mean, I really think that what motivated most of us to adopt this profession was because we do want to invite people into this beautiful world that we're in, right? And that means we don't want to leave some large fraction of them out. And so I think sort of adopting that attitude in that conversation can be useful. I also find in practical terms that it is really helpful as an entry point when people get comments back on their teaching, whether that's from mid-semester feedback or end of course evaluations. And a lot of times I think that can be startling, and people will have questions about why they get certain comments, and that can be an entry point to say, here are some of the things that your students may be thinking, experiencing, wondering. And so a little experiential learning there can be a prompt.
So that actually dovetails very nicely with a couple of questions that we've gotten. So I'm going to merge these into one question. So one, we're talking right now a lot about faculty development and faculty resistant to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and inclusive teaching in particular. One of the criticisms that can come out with any kind of teaching reform is it takes time. It means less rigor in the classroom. So how can we start showing faculty how to embrace a pedagogy of multiculturality? And can you give us specific examples of how to do that? We've been talking up here, but in your own faculty development work, what are some specific changes to pedagogy that help faculty move away from a colorblind modality into one that embraces multiculturality? So Cynthia, let's start with you and then go to Bryan.
Oh gosh, but that question has so many parts to it.
So many parts.
Okay, so I am going to be specific, but not address all parts of that question. So one thing that was very beneficial at my institution was what happened this last year. So in the last year, we had a great number of classes taught online and this was not something that our faculty had any experience with really at all. And so that disruption forced all of us to reconsider our teaching in a variety of ways. And that forced disruption really prompted some thinking about accessibility, which is not something that we focus on in our guide, but is certainly part of inclusive teaching. And also prompted faculty to think about what they were going to do during class time in a way that was extremely productive. It also got them thinking about assessment in ways that have been really productive. So when they were pulled away from being able to do in-class, closed book, solo exams, it got them thinking about what they really wanted to have happen during an assessment. And so one thing that has been really productive in my own efforts at faculty development this year has been capitalizing on those questions that arise for faculty members and those aha moments and providing opportunities for them to share that. So I find that as much as I think that I have great things to say, what I have to say has only limited value. And I'm not saying zero value, but only limited value for faculty. But when they are talking to each other and they're hearing colleagues who are in the same or a near discipline, that it has a bigger likelihood of changing their practice. And so because so many faculty did have big aha moments and really productive questions this year, bringing them together in formal and informal ways to share their experiences and share their questions has been really powerful. So that only gets at part of what that question was about, but it's what occurs to me in this moment.
Yeah, I agree that there's a lot to the question, and I'll try to perhaps get a little bit at it, but I have to start a little bit at the 30,000 feet, because it's the problems with some of, not problems with the questions, but one of the problems with equity in general is that before you get to specifics, you have to understand the context of how these things came to be, because if you kind of run to the what to do on Monday, right, then it sometimes gets applied in, out of context, and it could not work, right? One of the things we have to realize about college teaching is, with the exception of some boutique programs, and some of them are expanding, we don't really have an official pathway that prepares people for the classroom from grad school before the professoriate, right? Again, there are some boutique classes, but as a culture, that literally does not exist. What exists is, many of us get a doctorate in something very, very specific, right? We get hired based on the fact that we're the world's expert in that one cell, in that one animal, right? And then we say, oh, there's a classroom that you have to go teach. Yes, there are variations to that, and it's getting better, et cetera, et cetera. But what stems from that is this notion that one of my friends likes to call teacher dissertation. So you get in there to, in my case, I studied seagrasses. You get in there, you talk about seagrasses, because that's what you spend the last 6.5 years doing, right? So that then leads to an obsession with and a seeming inability to reduce content. It's one of the most I shouldn't say infuriating, but challenging conversations I have with faculty, because they almost can't even explain to me, just sort of feel this thing in them that you just have to. And in many cases, I've been told, like, yeah, I really actually don't get to it anyway. Like, well, then why are you, okay. So to specifically answer your question, Rebecca, my first thing is to cut content, right? And I've cut in Intro Bio, which is one of the classes that I teach, about 40 to 45% of the content that I met, right? And by cutting the content, it allowed for us to focus on more things like how to develop cultural awareness during group work. How do we explore more socially fractious case studies like the Tuskegee study or Henrietta Lacks or American Breeders Association? How do we spend more time writing? How do we spend more time in dialogue? Like removing this have to cover allowed us more time to do that. And because we were teaching people what it means to learn on your own, like, to take up a complex passage with protein names that you don't know, but feel confident that you could actually go through that and understand what's going on without Bryan standing next to you or Bryan repeating it in class, right? We've actually shown, and I know this is not a job talk, right? But we've actually shown that though we cut 45% of the class, the students from that class were doing a grade better from the sections that were trying to cover all those sections, right? Mm-hmm. So I actually have data that shows you the cutting content not only works academically, but it gives us more time to do some of these inclusive things that we're talking about today. And so I just wanted the question asker to know that that data exists, and I think that counts as a specific thing. There are many more, but that's one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. And we're starting to see more questions in the chat. Yeah, but how do I do this? What specific thing can I try in my class? And I think that what I'm hearing from you is that there's so much tailoring that needs to go on to how you implement this in particular. And the intent of the guide is to help you structure activities that you would want to implement either in faculty development or your own classes. So it's yeah, Cynthia, please.
Can I say something about that your own classroom thing? So I find it extraordinarily valuable to have a mental model and like in pictures, like the kinds of box and arrow models that I learned to draw in cell biology class as a junior in college, right? I find it extraordinarily valuable to have that sort of model in my head for my classroom. Our guide provides one such model. There are others, right? But the reason I find that valuable is because then I can think, okay, what am I going to do in this class for these students to develop a supportive classroom climate? Like, what are the structures that I'm going to put in place? For example, in my biochem course, which is a fairly high enrollment, I know that I'm going to put in, this sounds so simple, like I am going to put in think, pair, shares every in at least one in every class session. And in those, I'm going to structure it in a particular way. I'm going to give them time to think. And then when it's time for them to pair, I'm going to say, okay, person with the shorter hair, you talk first. Now let's switch. Person with the longer hair, you talk second. And in that class, I'm going to elect not to have this share out because I've gotten too much feedback from students over the years about, I'm not going to have share out in talking ways because I've gotten too much feedback over the years about how stressful it is for students to speak out in front of that group of 150. So I'm going to think about how I'm going to build that supportive classroom climate for that class. Then in my box, I'm going to think about, okay, what am I going to do to generate a sense of belonging and trust in me as an instructor? What are the specific practices? And then what am I going to do to support my students' self-efficacy? Like, how am I going to put that in? How am I going to ensure that students see the value in what we're doing? What reflections am I going to put in place? And so for me, having those box and arrow models in my head gives me some buckets to think about, what am I going to do in each one of these places in order to support the students that I'm working with every day? Now, the mechanisms that I'll use to do that will vary depending on the class. But so I don't know if that's specific enough. I suspect it may not be, but that is how I think about it.
Thank you, Cynthia. That's quite helpful. Bryan, we have a number of questions in the Q&A about publication around cutting content doesn't have a detrimental effect. So if you don't mind posting that paper, a reference to that paper into chat, that would be really helpful.
I would love to, but it's in review.
It's in review.
So midsummer it will be. I mean, it's going through some just minor changes right now, but it'll be up midsummer.
All right. Well, we're excited to read it. We're very excited to read it. So I'd like to pivot a little bit and ask some questions about the evidence-based teaching guides more generally. One of our audience members mentions that part of what these inclusive teaching guides do is make accessible so much of the literature from education in general, not just the bioeducation research. For new professors or those who want to start implementing evidence-based teaching practices in their own classroom, how do you start? How do you begin? Where do you dive into these evidence-based teaching guides?
Oh, so the point, the point of the structure of the guides is that it's a choose your own adventure. So when Christy Wilson and I joined the LSE board, I forget, 4 or 5 years ago, and we're in order to start this feature, the board had said we want to have a choose your own adventure way to explore. And so that is what we intend, is that, so I would recommend that a faculty member who wants to start using them, think about so first of all, what am I really interested in doing that I feel like I don't have all the pieces for? So is it group work? Do I want to know more about inclusive teaching? Ooh, I really like to use modeling in my classroom, but I want to know more about it. I pick my topic. And then, frankly, just go in and you can start at any point within the guides. Me, personally, I'd recommend starting with the theoretical underpinnings in every case, because that sort of top-down structure works for me. But you may think, no, I want to skip that. I want to go directly to, if I think about the group work one, I want to go directly to see what the evidence is on group size and group composition. And so you can hop in there. So follow your interest. Like the research tells us that doing that is most productive for you. So that's what I would say.
And I'm just catching up in the chat a little bit. All right. Thank you. It is overwhelming to think about how to start, but the choose your own adventure approach is really, really nice. And I have to say, this particular guide, the inclusive teaching one and the group work one, are two that come up in my professional development with beginning college instructors all the time. They're so accessible. And the summaries that you have of the papers that are included in the guide are quite helpful.
So glad.
Let me see here. So I think a similar kind of question is, what the question that I had just asked was, all right, you want to do this professional development on your own, how do you start? But there's another question about what if you're helping teach TAs? So you are in charge of leading the professional development for beginning instructors, and whether they're TAs or postdocs or some new faculty orientation or something. And how do you use this resource when you are structuring professional development?
Bryan, do you want to say?
You can go first.
Okay. So Christy Wilson, my co-editor, has a structure for doing this that she would be happy to share with you. Christy J. Wilson at marion.edu, she basically brings a group in and has them explore one paper. She basically uses the guides, I think, as a way to facilitate a jigsaw practice. So has participants dive into one node and then perhaps select one paper and then recombine and teach each other about it as a way to foster discussion. I personally, if I'm working with TAs or new faculty who are starting to think about this, I like to start not with the notion of this guide up front, but instead with their questions. So I really want to see where they are and from that figure out where they're ready to go. I also think a lot about reducing barriers. So I usually have in my pocket some low barrier ways for people to start thinking about inclusive teaching. So, I mean, like, learn your students' names, and if that feels overwhelming because of the size of your class, use that work from the Brownell group and use name tags, right? So that students perceive that you see them, you recognize them. You're right. So I'd like to start with the people's questions, like where they are, and I also like to have some sort of fairly straightforward ways to help them feel empowered as they head into this new endeavor. Now, Bryan, I gave you time to think. You'll have more to say.
Giving me time, that's such a dangerous proposition. Well, I will build on perhaps what you ended with, and that is the guide for me, as much as played a role in getting it written, comes later on in the faculty development experience. I mean, in the guide itself, we talk about self, we talk about students. So some of the things I'm about to say is mentioned there. But specific to the question being asked about TAs and postdocs, I like the question because it gets at a clear pet peeve of mine that this is not discussed as explicitly and comprehensively at that level as it should be. Assuming that these TAs, some of these TAs and postdocs may go on to become future faculty, not all may, but some might, that's an opportunity to really challenge them or help them kind of see what's possible with this position, with the opportunity to teach a classroom. Even if they choose not to go on to do that, a TA who has to teach a classroom at my university does have a responsibility to that university to be excellent. And so therefore it's our job to provide the kind of development that makes that happen. The guide was written to be very practical and a gateway to some of the theory that informs it. But in my style of faculty development, I always ask participants to really spend some time reflecting on why you do what you do and why does it matter. This to me is not the kind of occupation where we can pick up a bag of tricks and walk into a room, do them, and good things will happen. There needs to be some spirituality in this. There needs to be a sense of your own why and why it matters. What's the kind of greater purpose of being in a classroom and how that drives your behavior. There needs to be some work done on understanding who our students are, where they come from, what kind of psychological contingencies they may be experiencing. They don't come as blank slates. They come with social barriers they may have overcome. They come with strengths we haven't recognized yet. So a lot of work for me on the part of the practitioner, whether it's a TA, postdoc, or a faculty member, has to be up front. You have to do a lot of work, some data gathering on who's going to come into your classroom before you decide how much groups you're going to form and where the interrupted questions are going to lie and what the outside, the flipped classroom, like that stuff to me is 50% in. Well, we spend a lot of time really deconstructing the ecosystem of the classroom, things that a lot of people haven't really thought about. And then once we have sort of a shared understanding of that history, then we start talking about things like group work, interrupted questions. Because my question would be, well, why you want to put them in groups? Just because a publication said so? Like, what's your goal here, right? And so I kind of get to the meta question above the question before we just start deploying things. And I hope people understand that this can be used in context of perhaps a bigger conversation about the classroom work.
I appreciate you staging that, because when we begin our teaching, we're not experts, right?
Mhm.
And even when you've been teaching for a while, like the three of us have, we're still improving our teaching, right? So thinking about how expertise gets staged over time for us as individuals, right? That's a very personal trajectory,
Right.
is quite helpful. And we had a question that was about whether active learning is a way to start the colorblind conversation with faculty, right? So would a requirement to say use a think, pair, share in a class, keeping in mind Bryan's point about having the goal for using a think, pair, share quite clear, right? The pedagogical reasons and content reasons for doing a think, pair, share at a particular time. Is that a way to start beginning the conversations about why we need inclusive teaching practices, to just start implementing little techniques like that?
I think so. I'm sorry, Bryan, did you
No.
pick it first?
Cynthia, please go on.
So when I've been at Vanderbilt 9 years, and when I started trying to foster these questions in my role there, I started with active learning because there was a lot of support in the literature for it helping students, and there was some support for it helping some students more than others. And I thought that there, again, were low barrier practices for faculty to adopt. And so I thought that, to Bryan's point earlier about, sort of different things that people needed to hear,
Right.
I thought that it checked a lot of the boxes, right? So I could show graphs, and I could include student stories, and I could say it's not that hard. And so that, and I have found that having that conversation, 9 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, then facilitated our discussion of, what can we do we have some students in the back who don't want to engage. What can we do to ensure that they are getting the benefit of this experience? And so it was sort of a stepping into thinking about inclusion more broadly. So yes, I do think so.
Yeah, I think it can be. I would say it can be to a point, and I'm reflecting my bias here, right? I like it as a strategy. I do agree, just in principle, it can be a good entry point, but I think it depends on how it's deployed and how it's conceptualized in practice. And one of the things, so I do active learning. I do it, however it's defined 100 different ways, right? But I do it. I'm a believer in it, right? But I sometimes I see a lot of it being deployed as a just, here are these 20 things to do or 10 things to do or whatever, and not enough conversation on why each thing is important and what it gets at, right? And while I'm supportive of somebody, this being a way for them to start trying things, I would want whoever is working with them to make sure that there's an eye toward a greater reason why these things are important. And it doesn't remain at the level of, if you do these things, you'll be all right, right? And so I know that's not what you're saying, Cynthia, but I just feel that that point was important to me.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not what I'm saying. But yeah, I totally agree that the why is critical. But I think giving people the how can also be really helpful.
Yeah, and these are steps along that trajectory of professional growth that we were talking about. When we first began this conversation, it was very helpful to hear the parameters that you put around for how you interpreted inclusive teaching in this context, right? Inclusive teaching is such a broad topic. There are so many ways to think about people's different identities. And so you were very specific. But we've had a couple of questions that are about other kinds of diversity. So one is about diversity that we cannot see, diversity that's hidden. And how could we include that diversity? So what jumps to mind are things like sexual orientation, invisible disabilities, and also we have a question that gets at different belief systems, different ideas. So this member of our audience talked about animism. So looking at this idea that that different species have souls and are human-like, right? Some people will come into the classroom thinking that and others won't. So how are we, how can we take your central idea of honoring the person and expand the principles in the inclusive teaching guide to include hidden diversity and different philosophical standpoints that our students have?
Yeah, Cynthia, if I could just jump on that quickly. Well, first I would say, just harking back to your think peer share example, I felt very excluded with your short hair, long hair, because I don't know what you do with your no hair students, but I'm just saying I feel triggered by your choice. All right. But seriously, Becca, you would remember that what we said at the beginning was that it's about centralizing humanity. In fact, I actually many times take issue even with the term inclusive teaching, because what ends up happening is it becomes a thing, right? It's a type of teaching. And for me, good teaching is inclusive. It's not a type of teaching. It's not a way to teach. It's the way to teach, right? And so if the centralizing of humanity, right, and humanistic experience is at the core of how you enact the education experience, then diversity of all types comes under that, right? And I want the audience to be very careful with how we discuss things like diversity, because in America we are so used to lumping it into very neat boxes, right? Black, white, Hispanic, whatever the census says, and gay, straight, and it's complicated, right? How people identify, it changes over time. Somebody asked about immigrant faculty, and I can tell you for myself, I'm an international person of color. Yes, I'm Black in America, but it's a little different for me, right? And so one of the beautiful things about centralizing humanity is you learn to figure out what those different diverse identities are, right? You as a teacher, you are actually in a place of learning, right? People ask for a specific strategy early on in this call. I actually have them write an essay for me. It's This I Believe from NPR. Go to thisibelieve.org/guidelines. And I use that exact prompt. And every student writes me that essay before I meet them, and I read every single one. And in there, they talk about that, right? And so I'm trying to prepare myself for who they are as individuals, all 155 of them, right? So once when they write those essays, I'm starting to learn about some of those hidden diversities that I would not have seen if it was just me walking in the class in the first day of class, right? And I write my own and I share it with them, and I have a survey that I have them fill out about what things you're proud about. And there are ways to engage them as humans and not as students with ID numbers that can get at this sort of centralizing of humanity. I'll stop there because I think we have 5 minutes and I want to hear what Cynthia says.
I have one more question I'd like to ask Cynthia. So in a nutshell, please.
Oh, no, go ahead. So Bryan, I totally agree with what Bryan said. And because I do like those box and arrow models, after I start to get to know a bit about my students' humanity, I return to my little box and arrow model and I start thinking, okay, what did these students need for this to be a supportive classroom climate? What did these students need, this group of students need to help them feel a sense of belonging? So to me, knowing something about who they are and then thinking about those categories is very helpful. All right.
Thank you. So my last question for you today is, how can a younger researcher get involved with these kinds of conversations and research on evidence-based and inclusive teaching?
How can
a younger researcher get involved with research about evidence-based and inclusive teaching practices?
I'm not
Yeah, I guess just to clarify quickly, Becca, I'm not clear if the younger researcher is trying to do science education research as a full program, or are they a disciplinarian of another type who are trying to include this? I don't know, Cynthia. If you have
so the question that I have in chat is literally, or in the Q&A, is literally how a younger researcher get involved with this organization. And so we have different levels of what organization means, ACB, LSE, our particular labs. And I don't know what a young researcher means here, right? Are we talking about an undergrad, grad student, postdoc, early career faculty? So I think we can really open this. For me, I'm interpreting, because I'm at a primarily undergraduate institution, I read this as being written by an undergrad, and I would say, talk to your faculty members and express in their research.
Yeah, absolutely. And look for opportunities at your university for journal clubs around these topics or learning communities around these topics. Go to SABRE. Registration is $25 this year. I could not applaud that more. SABRE is Society for Advancement of Biology Education Research, and they have a meeting this summer. It's 4 Fridays in a row virtually. Registration's pretty reasonable. I would say all of those things. Bryan, what would you add?
Cynthia, the only thing I would add, just in case the person is like, say a young faculty member or postdoc and who wants to maybe get into some ed research, correct me if I'm wrong, but doesn't CB LSE have like a similar panel like this that goes over things about getting into education, science education research? I feel like I saw one advertised.
I don't know.
I'm pretty sure there is. Like, I hate to like stump everybody here, but I think this journal has that, like guides on how to get into science education research. All right. I'll follow up on that if I'm wrong, it's my bad, but I'm pretty sure.
Well, and Bryan, I think that looking up the recordings of online with LSE is actually a great place to start. And I'll also point out another feature that the journal has, which is the Anatomy of an Education Study feature. I am editing that feature with Clark Kaufman, and that is a series of annotations of paper.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Science in the classroom style annotations. And the annotations are introducing people to the methods and writing styles and approaches and topics and background that we are looking at in this field. So to conclude, I think we have one more slide that Cynthia is going to share. And we hope this has been helpful for you. We're sorry that we weren't able to get to all of your questions. But to conclude, we'd love for you to open up chat and tell us one interesting thing that you learned in today's session. Thank you so much, Bryan and Cynthia.